Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we are covering chapter 10, which is the last chapter of the Hill Myatt textbook. It's about international trade. And basically the reality of international trade is very different from anything that is written in conventional textbooks. So in fact the textbooks are designed to mislead students to think about things which don't matter and to not learn about the things which are important in international trade. So there are some basically the main issue is what is just, what is fair, and a lot of trading is done with great deal of injustice and by using power to exploit people, and this aspect is completely hidden in textbooks. There is a general principle of economic theory that if there is a transaction that is made between two parties that are willing, then both parties agree to it, so it must be good for both. And in a limited sense, this is true. That if a person is very poor and he has to sell his kidneys to survive, then somebody who buys his kidney is, both people are made better off. But there is more to it than just this, and that is what is not mentioned in the textbooks. So there is a huge gap between the theory of international trade, which is written in the textbooks, and the reality. For one thing, the comparative trade is based on the Heckscher-Ohlin model and theory of comparative advantage, and both of these models say that it is differences which drive trade. If the two countries are very different, then there will be trade. If the two countries are very similar, then there will be no trade. Now the reality is that European Union, within countries inside the European Union, which are very, very similar in many different ways, there is a huge amount of trade. There is very little trade between Europe and Africa. So what the theory predicts is exactly the opposite of what we see in the real world. So these are just some data on the amount of trade which is taking place. And generally speaking, the high-income countries are trading a lot, and the low-income countries don't trade that much. Now, there is a standard idea in economics that trade leads to growth. But this is actually not true. The reverse is true. Growth leads to trade. But all you can see here is correlation. And so the question is, why do people insist so much on arguing that trade leads to growth? Well, this has a lot to do with multinational corporations, which are not mentioned in textbooks, but we will see later. Alright, so this is the standard analysis of the effects of a tariff. So this is taken from Hill and Myatt. So it's considering a country which produces nails and it is also importing nails from the outside world. So there is a domestic supply of nails and a domestic demand for nails. And then there's the world price, which is below the equilibrium price. So given that that's below equilibrium, if there is no intervention in the market, then the horizontal line at the world price will be the price of nails. So the domestic supply will be the intersection of this line with the domestic supply. Then there is a large gap between that point and the domestic demand, and that gap will be filled by the imports. But now we suppose we try to protect the domestic industry by putting in a tariff. So that raises the domestic price by $1. So when we raise the price by $1, then the domestic supply will increase to the new intersection. The portion above the supply curve is the additional producer surplus which will be gained by this. So the producers will benefit from this by being shielded from the protection. But there is a loss to the economy of that triangle B. That triangle B is the additional cost that we have to pay to produce those nails, and that cost is unnecessary in some sense because other people can do it more cheaply. Then there is the portion, the rectangle C, that is the amount of revenue that the government makes from the tariff. And then there is the triangles D, which is the loss of consumer surplus that results because now consumers are buying at a higher price and a smaller amount. So this is the standard analysis of the effects of a tariff as found in conventional textbooks. Similarly, there's another type of restriction. Instead of putting a tariff, you can just put a quota that limit the amount of exports. So this is about the same as tariffs, but there is no tariff revenue. And then whoever gets the right to import extracts the additional revenue. So suppose we license this to foreign companies who send in who bring in the imports, then they will make the benefit from this, minus whatever licensing fees are charged. This is the kind of situation that is holding in our mobile telecommunications sector, where we give license fees to various phone operators, so we collect and then they make revenues because they are authorized to supply. The alternative is that domestic producers will buy nails from outside, and then they will be able to sell. They will be able to buy at world price and sell at domestic price, so they will make the revenue. So somebody or the other, and people say that, well, in this also you will get the corruption, that the difference, some portion of it will be marketed by the government, which will charge some price for this. It can do it legally by using license fees or illegally by using corruption. Effect is much the same. But the real world analysis of this is very different from the textbook diagrams. So all the economists agree that free trade is a wonderful thing. It always helps. And even one-sided free trade is a good thing, in the sense that suppose that the other country is imposing tariffs on my imports and putting their tax on their exports. Even then, if I don't have any restrictions, it will improve my country's welfare. Why? Well, there is an argument. Basically, you can get more goods at cheaper prices. And there's an important thing that comparative advantage is what matters, not absolute advantage. So one might think that, suppose that Pakistan is worse at producing everything relative to USA, worse in terms of having more costs of production. Then it seems that there might be no benefit to trade, because if we trade, then we will not be able to produce anything. But actually, that's not how it works. Basically, it's the theory of comparative advantage. If I have 2 employees in PIDE, one of them is very good at writing research papers, and the other one is very good at typing them up. But it turns out that the one who is doing research is also types faster than the other person who is good at typing. So then it's not true that I will give the typing task to the faster typist, because when he does research, he is producing more valuable work. So even though the other employee is worse at typing, his comparative advantage in typing means that he will get the work. And this is the standard theory of trade, that even if a country can produce a good more cheaply, more efficiently than the other country, its resource would be better used in producing high technology goods and leaving the low technology to the other country with the comparative advantage. So basically, comparative advantage just justifies trade in all situations. You don't have to look at absolute advantage. So the textbooks are uniformly in favor of free trade. So Mankiw says that the gains are larger than the losses. Free trade raises the total welfare, which is absolutely wrong. It's not true. International trade produces benefits for both. The world economy can achieve more efficient allocation. And some other advantages are that if you have foreign competition, then domestic producers move towards efficient technologies and management. And if you link economies, there is less chances for war. So these are some of the arguments given for free trade. As opposed to this, there are some standard arguments for protection. One of these is the national defense argument, that if you want to produce your own weapons, you don't want to be relying on outside countries to supply weapons during times of war. Similarly, there is the food weapon. If somebody else is growing food and you're importing, then you are vulnerable. Similarly, telecommunications is a sensitive industry. You don't want to turn this over to foreigners, because they can intercept your messages and so on. There is also the infant industry argument, which was actually invented by Friedrich List, who was a German economist. Initially, when England acquired a 50-year lead over the rest of the world in the process of the Industrial Revolution, then the free trade theory emerged for the first time in England. Now, this is very interesting. It did not emerge in other places. It emerged in the country which had the most to benefit by it. And so for a while, the countries in Europe agreed to this, and they started free trade, and as a result, their domestic production went very down, and their economies entered into a recession. So then List came along, and he said that free trade is fine if you have two countries which are equal, but when you have unequal countries, then it is very harmful to the developing industries to allow free trade, because they will never be able to compete and develop. So you have to protect your industries and allow them to grow up, and when they become strong, then they can be competitive. So they put down tariff barriers in Germany and in France, and that allowed the French and German industry to develop in face of strong British competition, which might not have been possible otherwise. Another argument for protection is that, for example, if Pakistan is exporting only raw cotton, then it is subject to risk of fluctuations. In fact, there are lots of fluctuations. So we would like to have a diversified basket of exports, and maybe our exports are not that competitive, but in order to, so we should protect them in order to insure ourselves against fluctuations. If we have a diversified bundle, then we will not suffer too much if the prices fluctuate. Another argument for protection is that it can be used as a retaliation against unfair trade. There are, if the other countries use unfair trading practices like dumping and subsidies, these are sometimes done to drive out domestic industries. For example, when the multinational ice creams came in, they did a price war with the domestic industry, selling their products very cheaply to drive out the domestic competition. And then once the domestic competition was gone, then they jacked up the prices. So this kind of thing one can use protection to prevent. Terms of trade basically refers to the idea that basically how many goods do we have to give and what do we get in return. So it's the real exchange rate as opposed to the currency exchange rate. So terms of trade can move in favor of you in the sense that how much cotton you give in order to import a Japanese car, this will vary, and the more you give, the less favorable terms of trade are. Now it turns out that if you put import duty, this can reduce the demand for imports, and by reducing the demand, you can reduce the the price will change of imports, and similarly the price of exports can be changed by putting export duties, and by manipulating this you can create a favorable movement in the terms of trade, so that by optimally adjusting the taxes you can in free trade, suppose that you're giving 1,000 bales of cotton for one car. By adjusting the terms of trade you might be able to change things so that you only have to give 800 bales of cotton to import one car. Now all of these arguments have counter arguments because free trade is a very strong theory. So these are just so for example, in terms of trade, the counter argument is that suppose that everybody starts following this policy, then this is a prisoner's dilemma type of situation where eventually everybody becomes worse off, and the gains that you would get if you put in tariffs and nobody else does would disappear. Similarly, for infant industries, you can support them without protecting them, and for all of these arguments there are counter arguments which can be made, and textbooks normally provide some counter arguments. So for example, if the automobile industry is collapsing, as we will see, you can protect it to protect the jobs, but there will be huge cost to the customer in this protection, in the sense that the prices will go up. If everyone is following protectionist policies, then the global aggregate demand will fall, and this will lead to less employment globally. So the idea that trade kills jobs, which is often said and is actually true locally, that is in USA, if you allow imports from China, it will destroy US jobs, but it will create Chinese jobs. So overall, when you look at the global perspective, it's not clear that there is a job loss from trade. And in fact, the opposite seems to be true. So one of the arguments is that the way laborers will be forced to work at wages which are prevalent in China in order to compete. And the counter argument to this is that no, the resources, the factors of production will be shifted to other industries where they have comparative advantage. I assume that all of you have economics background, so you've all been through this argument, so I don't need to actually spell it out. Now, the global trading system, General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, was basically this governs the rules. This is because in the global trade there are no rules. There's no one oversight. So there are these agencies which make the rules for international trade. So GATT was the system before 1995, and then WTO came into existence in 1995. And basically, this is resolves disputes between member states about trade, and new types of agreements can be negotiated there. And basically, this means that there is a global platform which governs the trading rules, which are all countries are subject to. In fact, the global trading system that we are living under is extremely unfair. It provides a lot of protection, and it provides lots of advantages to the rich countries and biased against the low-income countries. But this is not clear on the face of it. It's not apparent. It's hidden by false theories of trade which are taught in the textbooks. The WTO also allows for preferential trade agreements like the European Union. Customs Union. The Customs Union is a collection of countries which have common trading policies. They have all the same rules with respect to the outside world and same rules with respect to the member states. So within European Union, all countries have equal access to each other's markets, and if they export, then any export from Pakistan, they can tax, but the tax has to be the same in all of the countries. As opposed to this, there are also something which is called the free trade area, like NAFTA. In a free trade area, the countries like Mexico and America, they don't have any export duties or import duties, but they are free to make their own separate rules with respect to the rest of the world. So that is the basic theory. Now, what are the problems with this theory? So basically, the first thing is that trade always harms some group and helps some other groups. And so the Pareto principle doesn't apply. So we can't, according to the standard economic theory, compare. So how can economists say that free trade is good because their famous Pareto principle does not apply? So then they claim that they have an answer to this question, but they really don't. Also, all of this trade theory is studied under the assumptions of David Ricardo, which has many different elements which are not present. For example, the technology may be changing. There may be learning by doing, returns to scale. There are also lots of dynamic elements in trade which are not part of Ricardian theory. All of these things make a big difference, and if we take this into consideration, then all of the conclusions that are drawn about trade in textbooks turn out to be wrong. Then there is externalities which come in trading, many kinds of externalities which we'll discuss. Then there is incomplete information. The full information assumptions are not met, and this leads to serious problems with trade, we will see. Then there's issues of power. The more powerful countries, in this case it's actually the multinationals, make a lot of gains from trade, and they change the rules to their advantage, and they punish those who try to get in their way. So this is another source of distortions in trade. In order to understand realities of trade, instead of looking at diagrams and mathematics, one has to look at the real world, what happens, who trades what to whom, with whom, and what are the results. And one of the books which studies this is called Power and Plenty by Findlay and O'Rourke, and this is a very good book on trade. We'll talk about that later. So one of the major problems with the standard treatment of free trade is that they don't take into account how much time it takes to move from one equilibrium to the next equilibrium. So for example, suppose that as we allow Chinese air conditioners to come into our market, we have a domestic industry, the domestic industry collapses, all of the people in that industry become unemployed. So now the theory says that they will find better jobs in other industries where Pakistan has a comparative advantage. So does this happen? Well, when we study job loss, we find that the senior people never find a job in another industry, and junior people often find jobs, but not at the same pay, so they suffer loss. So there is substantial damage that is done to human beings, and the convergence can be very slow. So the global financial crisis in USA created a huge amount of unemployment, and Atif Mian Amir Sufi, who studied this, found that in California counties where plants had shut down and sources of employment had been lost, there was no change in population. In fact, in some of the counties, the population actually increased. So people don't move away from where they are just to search for jobs, because people have families and communities, and so the cost can be very high. This cost is not considered in economics, where you say, okay, you have one equilibrium, and now if you impose tariffs, you will get to the other equilibrium, without considering the disequilibrium dynamics, which is of all important. If the convergence is quick and fast, then of course the result would be valid, but if the convergence is slow and painful, then you need to take into account the costs of transition and maybe. So there are ways to study these dynamics, and in particular agent-based modeling is one of them, and probably not this semester, but next semester we might study some of these methods. So the terms of trade, again, we've discussed this. It's widely believed in Pakistan that today one of the reasons that our exports are doing badly is because the rupee is overvalued. Now actually our faculty member Atiqur Rahman has studied this, and he said that this is not true. In the past, depreciation has not led to an improvement in our earnings. So this is just, there are actually many different effects. One of the important ones, just for your education, is the Marshall-Lerner condition, that basically if you lower the price of exports, you will sell more. So there's a product involved, the price is less and you're selling more, will the total be less or more? Depends on the elasticity. And basically the Marshall-Lerner condition is that if the absolute sum of the long-term export and import demand elasticities is greater than unity, then you will improve your export revenue. And if this is not so, then things will deprove, things will become worse. It's easy to see, and I assume that you've all seen it, so I will not go through a proof. Similarly, tariffs are, if I remove tariffs, then the imports are cheaper, and so this makes people better off. But the exportable goods in our country will become more expensive, so it's not clear that the consumers are better off. For example, if a country is isolated and it produces just agriculture, then everybody has plenty to eat. But now suppose that it opens up to trade and it starts selling wheat and rice and cotton in order to get cars and helicopters. So the price of wheat and rice will rise in domestic market, making the vast majority of the population worse off, and a few people who are able to import the luxury goods that you buy with this will be made better off. So can we say that the country is better off? According to the economists, yes, but according to the reality, no. So the economists argue that we can use the compensation principle, that if the gainers can compensate the losers, then the change is justified. Basically, Pareto principle itself is very, very shaky and very actually not true. But let's accept that it says that if everyone is better off, then the country as a whole is better off. But now they say that if the country gains enough wealth so that this wealth can make everybody better off, then it is still better. So basically, it's a question of, if we get more money, even if all of that goes to one person, the country is still better off, because at least potentially this could be distributed. So in effect, this relies on a trickle-down approach, that once the wealth accumulates, it will automatically go to the people. But trickle-down doesn't work. And basically, again, it ignores the idea of distribution. And this is standard economic theory, which I have written about, that the economic theory is really the economic theory of the top 1%. As long as they are made better off, you don't care about the rest of the country. So the thing is that the economists here are making a normative judgment that the country is better off. This is something which they say that we don't do. But now, in the case of free trade, they are making normative. The question is, who are they to make the judgment? If it is a situation where a large number of people are going to be made worse off and a few people are going to gain, then in a democracy this would not pass. So there are other ways to make such decisions, and many different people can have different views on the morality of this. So the economists are making a moral argument, but not being explicit about it. So there are strong alternatives if the changes are of catastrophic in the lives of a small sector of people and make only a minor difference to a large numbers of people, then many people would judge that this is not a good change. So it's very clear that the textbooks have an ideological bias for free trade. So, one of the there is a large number of very bad arguments used in textbooks, and these bad arguments are backed up by very complex mathematics which make them appear impressive and formidable. So one of them is the famous Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model. This is called a 2 by 2 by 2 trade model. That means there are two countries, there are two factors of production, and there are two commodities. Yes. Now, this model makes a very large number of highly unrealistic assumptions. The technologies are the same in all countries, both countries, and the only difference between the countries is in the factor endowments. Now, both the model and the results are in conflict with real-world observations. The most famous being the Leontief paradox. According to the basic result of this model, there are a number of results. That the first thing is that the country which is capital rich will export capital intensive products. The country which is labor rich will export labor intensive products. Now, Leontief noticed that USA has much more capital than the other countries, but its exports are not capital intensive, they are labor intensive. So there's been a huge literature and controversy, and other people have recalculated and said that no, this is not true. The strange thing is that why do we think that a 2 by 2 results from a 2 by 2 model would apply to the real world? And that's really the problem with economic theory, that they make these models which are completely divorced from reality. Just like I explained about the taxation, that let's pretend that any group can tax the minority, and the minority gets to burn their endowment instead of being appropriated, and let's calculate the equilibrium of this game and then see if this corresponds to taxation. Well, when you have made such unrealistic assumption, then there is no reason to expect any match between the outcomes of the model and the reality. And so, one of the things that the model says, is that the trade is driven by dissimilarity. This result holds more generally, that comparative advantage also leads to the same result, that dissimilar countries will trade. But the reality of the world is that that's not true. Similar countries trade much more, and countries at different levels of development don't trade very much. And this Heckscher-Ohlin theory also leads to factor price equalization theorem. If you have one of the factors abundant, you will start exporting. It will have higher demand. So the abundant factor, which has a lower wage, its demand will rise, so its wage will rise, and ultimately the factor prices will be equalized. So again, this is not true. In the real world, there are many counterexamples to this idea of equalization. So now in the anti-text, we relax some of these Ricardian assumptions, and we ask what happens when we change things. So now one of the things is that technological catch-up can change the comparative advantage. So according to the theory, we shouldn't be producing in sectors we don't have comparative advantage in. But for example, Korea did not have a semiconductor industry, and they didn't have anything to create. I mean, they didn't have any comparative advantage in that. So they started from zero, and they put a huge amount of investment to create a semiconductor industry, and now their industry is one of the strongest in the world. Similarly, and if you are growing wheat and cotton, you won't have a comparative advantage in the production of airplanes, but once you start producing, you might, after doing the right, basically you will have to protect your infant industry. As in China, for example, they didn't have an aircraft industry. They invited Boeing to come in, and they forced it to transfer technology because Boeing was in financial difficulty. So they gave it the lure of coming in and capturing the huge market, but in return they asked that you will produce domestically and you will increase domestic content and you will have train our people so that ultimately in 10 years we will acquire the entire technology. And so 10% every year they managed to now China has its own airplane industry. So this comparative advantage is something which exists at one point in time, but there is no reason to believe that it will always be the same. And so if we can do things, any comparative advantage says that you should produce this and not that, but that's only valid for this moment of time. And if the technology changes the comparative advantage, then the theory doesn't hold. Now, for example, corporations move jobs to cheap labor countries. Laborers lose jobs and communities. Corporations increase profits enough to compensate the laborers. Both countries are richer, and losses of labor employment in one country may be compensated by increased employment in the other. But are we should we let the market make this trade-off, or should we intervene with this in this? There are many normative considerations involved, and it is almost obvious that the market will not automatically arrive at the right at justice. In fact, nobody defends the market for producing just outcomes. Even the free market defenders don't make that argument. So increasing returns to scale is another such case where basically the first person in the race will win. And so if one country starts in technology where there's increasing returns, it will acquire a huge advantage over others. And once it's producing, it's very hard for anybody else to come into that market. Now, it may not be that the country which is producing is the right country, because it's just a matter of timing who comes in first. And it may be that the production would be better in some other country, but historical accident led some other country to capture this gain. So basically the free market process leads to arbitrary outcomes which may not be just, may not be feasible, may not be economically efficient. There's a huge number of externalities which have a massive effect on trade. The most important is the greenhouse gases, which are emitted by many industrial processes. They are also emitted in travel and transport. So if we were to put restrictions on GHG emissions, this would be good for all of humanity, but it would be harmful to corporate profits who rely on these industries and rely on trade and travel and transport to make profits. So it would harm the corporations, and so they don't allow it to happen. But as a result, the planet is suffering serious damage. So another example is that if we give private companies the permission to cut down the forest and export it for wood, as is happening all over the world in the Amazons and the other. So we are destroying natural wonders, we are destroying the ability of the peasants to survive from the land, and we are creating profits for the rich. So basically it's a way of taxing the rich to give money to the poor, taxing the poor to give money to the rich. Now the economics theory that we read provides us with wrong ways of thinking about externalities, because it only considers the monetary cost. So how much does it cost to clean up the gas? It doesn't actually consider the Um, a lot of costs are simply not mentioned, like the cost of using up a natural resource are not mentioned, the cost of destroying a species of animal which can never be recreated, or biodiversity. These costs are simply not calculated. The only thing that economics calculates is that, is it true that the rich are making enough money so that if they wanted to, they could compensate the poor for the amount of income that they have lost? So this is a very silly question to make the decision on the basis of. And that is what the economists do, that they say that as long as the rich can compensate the poor, they don't even have to actually compensate them, then the country is better off. So one of the famous economic theory arguments is that you should just export the pollution to the poor countries, because the rich can afford to pay for clean atmosphere, but the poor cannot. So if there is a polluting industry here, it will cause damage to the health of the poor people, but the poor people are not they need the income generated by the industry more, so it is efficient economically. So there is a memo written by Larry Summers advocating this, that this is what will create efficiency. I think one of our students has a project to write about this. Has somebody got a project? Yes, right. So I will not talk about this. I didn't, but she will. Actually, what I wanted to say was, next class on Tuesday, I want one presentation from each group, and I want this presentation particularly because it ties in to what we are doing. And then you will have the second presentation can be 1 week later, and in the third session we should finish all the presentation. So basically, according to standard economic theory, if we take polluting industries and move them to low income countries, the world will be better off. This is the standard argument. So basically, it's the argument that this is actually happening today, because basically it's not due to economic efficiency, it's due to power and disinformation. You see, when you send toxic materials to countries and you don't provide them with information, obviously, about the effects of this. So currently there's lots of toxic dump being thrown by advanced industrial countries into the poor countries. They buy their land and they bury their waste, and they cause huge amounts of health damage to children. So the main problem is that the corporations are not required to bear the cost of this pollution, and efforts have been made to try to get them to bear this cost, but this would actually lower their profits, and profits is the driver of capitalism, and so the corporations are too powerful to allow their profits to be taxed away. And so trade is actually causing enormous amount of damage to countries, and this is nowhere mentioned in textbooks. So the question is that should poor people be allowed to sell their organs? why should countries have to choose between either poverty or poison? So, one aspect of consumption which economic theory says which is different from how human beings behave is that we think about the process by which the good is produced. The good is not, when you have a cup of coffee, it's not just, according to the economics theory, the only thing which matters is the coffee, not how it got there. But actually people do take into consideration how things were produced. And so there's this movie about blood diamonds which led a lot of people to not buy diamonds because they saw the process by which diamonds are produced involves a lot of wars and conflicts. So if the coffee is being produced on a place where due to a lot of exploitation of laborers and people are being beaten and tortured, then you might say that, well, I will choose not to. Like people have stopped wearing fur, natural fur of animals, because people are killing animals to take off their furs because it was very popular at one time. So to some extent, I mean, there are many such examples. So people understand and care about the process, not just about final goods. So this is what has led to the development of fair trade, where people say that we we source our materials. So you have this shop in Centaurus which says that we source our materials by using, we pay fair wages to the people, and our products are more expensive, but that's because we are doing justice in our trade. And so people buy the more expensive product because they want to be part of a just system. So there are many examples of how this fairness works and is counter to standard economic theory. For example, there are child labor laws in which basically people avoid using children to produce. There are laws against production in sweatshops where people are exploited heavily to produce, given very low wages. There's the example of there's a French delicacy called pâté de foie gras, which is the liver of a duck. So what they do is they force feed these ducks by a really cruel process, and it gives them a disease which causes their liver to expand, and then this is used to produce this delicacy. And once this was advertised, many people stopped eating this, so because it was cruelty to animals. So we want to buy recyclable products to prevent waste, pollution, even if they are more expensive. And generally speaking, Islam has a solution. These are just what is called palliation, band-aid solution. But Islam actually has the solution to the problem, in that business is not allowed to be run for profits. In fact, Allah Ta'ala says that those people who acquire money and don't intend to use it for the purpose in the path of Allah, then let them be prepared for Allah Ta'ala's curses or damage. So just earning of money is not permissible in Islam. You can earn money provided that you plan to use it for some good purpose. And so the Islamic business model says that we are trying to provide a service. So if you are polluting the atmosphere in your Islamic bottom line, you will subtract this pollution because you are providing a disservice. So you look at the whole thing. So Islam also has end-to-end considerations, that you don't look at you look at the whole thing. You're not allowed to think of just a small part of the process. So, for example, in Islamic law, the person who witnesses the transaction of interest, and the person who writes, and the person who transacts, they are all partners in the crime. So, being a small part of the process doesn't take away the guilt. So you can say that if you're doing if you're not the sole responsibility, you see in the when Hitler was burning the Jews, a lot of people participated. There was the train driver and the wood supplier and the manufacturer of the ovens in which people were burned. All of the people said, I'm not the one who's doing it, because somebody else is going to carry out the order. So nobody felt responsible. But in Islam, every single one of them is responsible. So when you are responsible for everything you do, then you can't say that my business is to manufacture the leather, and the fact that I'm polluting the river in the process is not my concern. No, the whole thing has to be your concern. And you have to calculate, am I providing a net benefit to society or am I not? And not whether I'm doing something which will make profits for myself. So this is the solution, but this is not in the Western mindset as yet. They don't have an understanding of this. So now, in theory, in economic theory, with perfect information, no externalities, no market power, no democracy, or no power, then the fair trade movement makes no sense, and in fact none of the things that actually happen in the real world can be explained by the textbook theories. So one of the important aspects of the game is that the power is of essential importance. The rules of the trading game are made by the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. There are many rounds of negotiation, and it's routinely true that the interests of the rich countries are opposed to the interest of the low-income countries, and there's negotiations, and very often the powerful countries get to impose their own rules because the other countries are not sufficiently powerful to resist. Textbooks will not give us any clue about what is going on in these negotiations, because according to the textbooks, you should all just get rid of all the rules and let it be a free world. But so what is the negotiation about? Both parties are going to benefit from just dropping all the taxes and the trades. So there is nothing to negotiate. But actually this is not how it works, and textbook theory will not allow you to understand what is going on. To understand what is going on in the Uruguay round or the Doha round, all of these things, to understand these you have to have a real understanding of trade as opposed to the textbook understanding. So the economic systems, the reality of economic system is that there is a fierce struggle for power going on. It's a competition in which the powerful are trying to change the rules of the game in their favor, and also trying to mask this by propagating false theories. They don't want to say, if they sell you toxic goods, they say, no, this is good for you. So then it becomes difficult for people to understand that this is not the case, because there's a lot of powerful propaganda that is done. So the outcome of this battle is not an optimal system, but it reflects the interests of and the bargaining power of the various groups. A few rich countries dominate the WTO, and it is dominated by large corporations. So, for example, the worst example of corporate power given in the text is the TRIPS, trade-related property and rights. What? Intellectual property, yes. So basically, the patents exist in the rich countries. They protect their and today, strangely enough, the largest amounts of revenue is going to the rich countries, not on account of goods they provide, but because of the patent protection that they have. They prevent the poor from copying technology to extract the tax. Now, actually, this is prohibited in Islam, that knowledge is a free good, and just for somebody to make profits from this is very harmful. Enormous amounts of wealth is transferred from the poor countries to the rich countries in terms of these, by denying them access to technology, which would be easy to replicate. False arguments are made to sell these things to the poor countries, to the low-income countries. So our people will go around and write articles on how intellectual property rights are good for Pakistan and we should enforce them and so on, which is simply bosh if you look at the cost and benefit. BT cotton is just one example of what happens. It's a very high variety yield cotton, but millions of dollars were spent on research to make sure that the cotton, when the seeds come out of the cotton, this seed is second-rate BT cotton. It doesn't have the same properties as the original. You can still use it, and then the third generation is third degree, and after that, basically, it becomes very bad. So now, according to Islamic views, even the development of BT cotton was wrong. I mean, when you have a high yield variety, this is something which is beneficial to the world. Why you spend millions of dollars to research creating a variety which will have a terminating seed? So this is the technical terminology. There's non-terminating seed. So the plant has a seed. The seed produces the same plant back again. That's the standard, usual. Now they use genetic modification to basically handicap the seed, make the seed inferior, so that every time you have to buy seed, so they get profits. Now I think that it would not be permissible in the Sharia to do such a modification to cause harm to people to make personal profits. And this also, I think it's al-ihtikar, the person who hoards vital goods and prevents to make profits at the expense of the people, he is the cursed of Allah. So this kind of research is actually accursed in Islam. But
so it also stops the evolutionary process, natural evolutionary process of the seeds.
Yes, well, that's more even GMO Monsanto is doing that. What they produce crops and they put poison in them that the same crop grown from ordinary seeds will die. So once you plant it, then there's you can't go back to the original plants. So this kind of very nasty stuff is actually going on. And the USA tried to patent basmati rice, and Pakistan had to fight the case in court for a long time to prevent them from doing so. I think they finally won, but so in a bilateral agreement, the theory says that all the benefits go to the smaller country because basically the large country, the prices don't change, so the smaller country makes the major benefits, but it also requires major adjustments in the small country. And so the transition costs to new equilibrium are all borne by the smaller country. So this is one of the things which is not mentioned in the textbook's argument. Also, free trade creates a dependent economy. If you like in Mexico and USA, once you create a free trade, then Mexican economy becomes dependent on the US economy for certain types of goods. And this dependent can be exploited by the powerful country. For example, in the Canada-USA lumber agreement, Canada produces a lot of lumber very cheaply relative to the USA. So the USA lumber companies were hurt by this, and they sued Canada that they are dumping and they are doing this and that. And they lost all their cases because Canada has a natural advantage. It was not doing anything unfair. Nonetheless, they utilized power to twist the arms of the Canadian government and made them agree to pay $1 billion in damages to the US lumber industry, even though it was completely illegal. It was just an exercise of power. And given the power imbalance between Canada and USA, their only choice was to pay the bhatta to the USA in order to. So FDI and multinational corporations both are massively important, but they are absent in theories, in trade theory. The point is that if you have a firm, it maximizes profit. So it doesn't matter whether it's a foreign firm or a local firm, according to theory. But in reality, it makes a big difference. Here is some data on the FDI. Now it turns out that the largest amount of FDI is between the high-income countries, and there's much less which goes to the low-income countries. Now there is something a little bit strange about this, because the growth rates in the low-income countries are high, and so the investments pay off more. There is a big theory about why investments do not go to the low-income countries as much as they should, in accordance with the return that is available. The main issue of power is that multinationals trade with low-income countries, and this trade is driven by the power of the multinational countries. The large multinational corporations have a much bigger budget than most of the low-income countries in the Pakistan in the world, and so they can actually do a lot of things. Like, in fact, basically we talk about corruption and bribery. So there are two sides of this, and basically it's MNCs on one side which are creating the corruption in terms of buying officials to further their own interests. So multinationals routinely use false advertisement to capture markets in the low-income countries. For example, in the Philippines, UNICEF study shows that 16,000 children under 5 die every year because of using infant formula. And how do they do this? Because the poorer families are convinced by campaigns that if you buy this formula, it will make your child more intelligent, and so he will have a better life. And it's completely false, actually. The studies show the reverse is true, that the breastfed children have better cognitive abilities. So in 2006, Philippines put new laws. The WHO's International Code of the Supreme Court of Philippines rejected the producer's appeal. The producer appealed that don't put these rules on us. This has happened often, that in one country they were passing laws to ban the use of cigarettes, and in another country they were suing the country to allow imports of to allow their exports of tobacco, and they were fighting cases that if the country was trying to prevent it or tax it. So entirely different policies for whites and blacks. So the Supreme Court was pressurized into reversing its ruling. The Supreme Court originally rejected their appeal, but then 4 days later, ultimately the Philippines won this case with the help of some international activists, and so the new rails were reinstated. But it doesn't always happen. Many times the countries lose the fight against the multinationals, and they are forced to accept harmful, for example, consequences. So foreign direct investment is very closely related to power. British imperialism, analyzed by Davis and Huttenbach, says that it's basically a mechanism for transferring wealth from the middle class to the rich, also of course gathering wealth from the colonies. So basically it was the middle classes which supported the empire, which provided the soldiers and the tax, and the rich gained the benefits of the empire. Similarly, General Smedley Butler, very famous, his books are still taught in the US Army, but there is one book he wrote which is not taught, in which he writes that after 33 years he came to the realization that I'm just a muscle man, a mafiosi for the Wall Street, and all of the wars that we are fighting, it has basically to protect the profits of Wall Street. So in Nicaragua, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, all of these American army interventions, they were just to protect the US business interests. There is this book, Power and Plenty by Finlay and O'Rourke, which I have mentioned. It goes back to ancient history, and it basically argues that no history of trade can ignore conflict, use of force, military, and geopolitics, because trade is so intimately related to power politics that to study it without you can't understand it. So, for example, free trade was imposed on China by force in the Opium Wars. Similarly, there were 2 attacks on Japan. So the whole country, according to economic theory, free trade is a wonderful thing for China. It should want it, but British imposed it by making war, and the only condition of the war was that from now on your borders will be open to free trade. So China people should have been very happy. Similarly, the same thing happened to Japan. A expedition led by 4 countries, US, Britain, France, and Germany, invaded Japan, and they made a treaty, and there was only one term, that your ports will be open to foreign goods. So again, Japanese should have been jumping with joy, because it made them better off. But actually what has happened is that free trade is a weapon which harms the country. In more recent history, when Iran, a democratically elected president, very popular, this is 1953. Mossadegh. He nationalized Iranian oil. So CIA engineered a coup against him, placed Shah in his power, and basically the goal was to allow the American and the British companies to control the oil of Iran. In 1953, there was a military coup in Guatemala because the United Fruit Company Guatemala was trying to nationalize their properties. So they created a coup, installed the military, and protected the interests of United Fruit Company. In 1973, there was a military coup in Chile because, again, the Chilean government was causing damage to American business interests. Colombia has free trade agreements with USA and Canada, and basically it keeps labor in control by killing trade unionists, and so basically the 2,000 have been killed in the past decade or so. And so the Colombian trade is dictated by the terms that are. Similarly, the Iraq war was to get control of the oil resources of. So this is the nature of trade. Libya was destroyed and Syria was destroyed. All of this has to do with multinational corporations and nothing to do with politics as such. So the textbook concealed the realities of trade by engaging students in discussion of trivial and unimportant issues. History we need to study to understand what really happens. Now I'll look at a particular special case, which is the case of the voluntary export restrictions on Japan's export to automobile in 1970s. So in 1952, the chairman of General Motors said that what is good for the country is good for General Motors, and vice versa. There's an identity of interest. But later on, it may have been true at that time, but later on the interests of the American automobile makers diverged significantly from the interests of the US. So what happened in the 1970s was that the Japanese car flooded the US market. What happened was that the oil crisis in early 70s led to a sudden jump in oil prices. Basically, the US supported Israel in that war, Yom Kippur War, and in retaliation for this, the Arab countries said that we will put an embargo on oil exports to USA, and when they did that, the oil prices jumped. Now, the US car market, the US automobiles were large, inefficient, and Americans liked big cars. The Japanese cars were cheap, they were very fuel efficient, and they were very reliable. Around the same time, the environmental concerns were starting to become important, and so the USA put in new safety and emission standards. And again, these were the American cars were very inefficient and very very pollutant. The Japanese car had far superior quality in terms of needing very few repairs, whereas the American cars would break down very often and require expensive repairs. And there was the Japanese car had a high cost advantage because they had superior management in Japan, they had lower wages, they had higher productivity, they kept smaller inventories, reducing overhead costs, and they had a yen which was relatively cheap compared to a strong dollar. So because of all of these four factors, the Japanese cars became very important in the market, especially after the oil price increase. Then it became very expensive for the Americans to drive American cars. So there was a huge shift to Japanese cars. So there was a 10% loss of market share in a period of 5 years in the 70s. In 1980, all four there's the big four, Chrysler, American Motors, Ford, and one more. They all had combined losses of $4 billion. So they went to the government for protection. American Motors was bought by the French car company Renault, and the US government bailed out Chrysler. There was 40% unemployment in the American auto industry and its suppliers. Ford and United Automobile Workers filed petition with US government for aid. They also filed cases against the Japanese industry for unfair competition. But these cases they all lost. The ruling of the courts were that the incompetence of the American car industry was responsible for their failure and not the Japanese imports. They were making very different types of cars. They were not direct competitors even. So the government provided tax cuts, subsidies and aid to the industry and relaxed regulation because the automobile owners made the case that this is necessary, otherwise we will lose jobs. That was their argument. They didn't, whenever you argue, you don't argue for your profits. You argue for that you are looking out after jobs. In fact, they didn't protect jobs later on, but we will see that. So, for example, when some students want readmission, they say that we are striking in favor of reducing the tuition. They're really not concerned about tuition, but they want to have the support of other students. So, as a result of this, ultimately they failed to do this properly. So basically, Reagan pressurized Japan that unless you do something about this, we will be forced to take action illegally. Legally they couldn't. So basically Japan said, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to put in voluntary export restriction. By ourselves, we are just going to decide not to. So there is no law, but the Japanese said that we will keep our car exports at 1.68 million, which was the reference year. That okay, this was our exports, and we'll just keep it at that level for next several years. So this is called a VER. So it was supposed to be a temporary measure in order to allow the US industry to reform and catch up, and they would make smaller cars, they would create fuel efficiency, they would improve their productivity and quality so as to be able to compete. And then the hope was that they would regain the $300,000 worth of jobs that had been lost. In March 1985, the quota was continued with a slight increase in the middle in 1984 to 1.85 million. In 1985, the US auto industry posted record profits, and so there was no longer any basis to ask for VER. But nonetheless, the Japan continued the voluntary export restrictions after raising the limit to 2.3 million, supposedly to counter anti-Japanese feelings in America. There were campaigns that be American, buy American. But actually, as we will see, the voluntary export restrictions, supposedly which should have hurt Japan, actually helped Japan. And they should have helped the US industry, but they didn't actually do so. In 1992, again, the US industry was in big trouble and having huge losses. So in 1992, again, Japan agreed to cut back its VER and cut back again to 1.68 million to help out the US auto industry. So now this is the standard diagram, supply and demand. What happened? Okay, so when the Japanese put on the VER, the price of Japanese car jumped by about $2,800. Actually, I was in the USA, and it was very sudden that cars were very cheap in the US, and suddenly they were costing at least $1,000 more. It was noticeable. The Japanese cars jumped by that much, but the American cars jumped also by $1,200, not as much. So according to the demand-supply theory, we can look at this, that here's the supply curve and the demand curve, and now there's a price ceiling, there's a quantity ceiling at A3. So the supply curves become vertical at that point, so the price will jump. So that's what the standard theory says. But this theory is not correct for many reasons. This diagram is not correct. First of all, the US industry is supposed to be benefiting from it. They want the Japan to cut so that they can expand. So obviously, Japanese cars and American cars are supposed to be substitutes for each other. So, and the demand for Japanese cars is not independent of the demand for American cars. So if this is not a separate market, you can analyze in isolation. So so this diagram is very confusing and actually wrong, because neither the demand curve is correct. I mean, basically, the demand supply is based on what is called ceteris paribus, everything else equal. But here, there is one whole market, which is the American automobile. If this was a separate market, then they wouldn't have asked for the Japanese to reduce their exports. So the fact is that wherever this gap is, it's being filled by the American cars, and unless we take into account these complicated interactions, we cannot understand what happened. And it is possible to take care of these complicated interactions by, again, using different mathematical methods, different types of modeling techniques, which I hope I will be able to teach you later next semester, not this one. So, what happened as a result of the new strategy of voluntary export restrictions in Japan? Well, clearly with a fixed number of cars, price competition was no longer a viable. This was the way that they had won. They were producing cheap cars. American cars were expensive, so they were gaining the market. But now, with a limited number of cars, competing on price is not a good strategy, because you only have one car. If you charge less for it, you will get less money. So they shifted to non-price measures. They started making very high quality cars like Lexus, Acura, Infiniti. These were high-end models which were meant to compete with the expensive American cars, and they were far higher in quality. They increased their advertising. Basically, there was some Be American, Buy American type campaign. So they I love my Toyota and this kind of thing where campaigns were introduced. So they introduced branding, product differentiation, customer loyalty packages. They also set up plants inside America that would be, some of them were joint, with American companies, some of them were independent. So those plants which were producing in USA, they were not subject to these export constraints. And the Japan's auto cartel agreed. They sat together and they said, okay, here's our quota, and you can have this much, you can have this much. So basically, the main problem of cartel is that there's this prisoner's dilemma that people want to undercut the others, but this problem was solved for them by they could actually make a legal cartel. And the USA could not complain about this thing because they had actually asked for it. So economic theory predicts that if you constrain the imports to the country, it will cause them loss. They cannot sell as much as they want. Obviously, the free market. This did happen initially. There was a 7.5% drop in the market share, but it was later recovered. And there were lots of beneficial effects. The Japanese companies had a huge amount of increased profits. They improved their quality of their cars. There was much greater brand admiration for the Japanese cars. People came to appreciate Japanese cars' advantages much over the American cars. What were the effects on the US auto producers? Well, the demand for their products increased because obviously there was only a limited amount of demand that could be supplied by the Japanese cars. So in the first instance, you have a higher demand, so they could charge higher prices and they could increase their market share. And both of these things happened. The average price of the American increased by $1,200, and the market share increased by 7.5%. And basically, this was a pure transfer from consumers to producers, about $5 billion. So this may have been an intended effect that the company makes profit so that they can invest. But they didn't do that. there were record profits in the car industry. And that's why a few years later, the automobile industry, which was in loss, was now booming. Instead of retooling to produce better cars, they reduced the labor use. They used this money to automate their plants and reduce their labor use, and they got cheaper labor because they negotiated agreements with their trade union saying that, look, we are in trouble, so you should accept wage cuts. So instead of helping the labor, they actually harmed labor. And so all of these measures improved their profile and gave them record profits. So what did they do with it? So rather than investing that in improving in their productivity, quality and styling, the auto executives purchased other industries to diversify, to protect them from the risk from loss of the automobile business. Meanwhile, and they gave the new executives like Lee Iacocca and others, they were labeled as superstars who saved the automobile industry, whereas in fact it had been done by Japan, and they gave them multi-million-dollar bonuses. So these money was not used in the way it was supposed to. Japan re-strategized to recapture the market share. So although they lost the initial share, they eventually got it all back. Meanwhile, Japan was in the niche for cheap cars and it had abandoned this niche. So other countries like Korea and some others came into this market with the cheap cars, which only the VER was applied to Japan, so they could come in with new cars, and so they also. So all the effects of the VER was the opposite from the intention. Instead of creating competitive pressure on the US industry, it actually relaxed and they enjoyed their profits instead of using these profits to retool. This often happens, by the way, everywhere. It's not just US. So there were huge costs to the US consumers. The price of cars jumped immensely. There was no real job creation. The employment didn't go up. So those people who were told, like Lee Iacocca, was that, look, you said you were going to create jobs. He said, well, what's happening is that we are preventing job loss. So some economists estimated that, yes, that is true. There would have been more job loss if the VR had not been in place. They said they saved about 75,000 jobs at the cost of nearly 160,000 jobs per job per year, which is more than the laborers were actually making. All right, so what I'm saying here is that there is a lot of interesting